We're here today to talk about what really motivates employees. Businesses invest in employee well-being to achieve many things. A top goal is boosting employee engagement. According to Gallup, companies with engaged workforces outperform those that don't, and they see lower turnover, better customer service, and higher profits.
Yet, research shows that only a third of U.S. employees are engaged at work. This raises the question, what really leads to high engagement? And what can employers do to ensure their workplace programs have the best chance of success?
Our guest today is Dr. Scott Rigby. He's an author and research psychologist who applies self-determination theory, or SDT, to boost employee engagement. Scott's the CEO of motivationWorks, a consultancy that helps companies improve employee engagement and workplace cultures.
Today, Scott's going to discuss his ideas on employee motivation engagement, provide an evidence-based framework on human motivation, and explain how employers can design employee well-being initiatives for high employee participation that ultimately leads to positive business outcomes. Scott, thanks for being here today.
Hey, it's great to be here, Jim and Steve.
So let's start with some foundational definitions. So we're going to be saying employee motivation, employee engagement a lot in this conversation. What do you mean by those two things, motivation and engagement?
I always kind of start when we talk about engagement to say everybody knows it when they see it, but everybody also has a different definition for it. But engagement is the kind of observed outcome of someone being really motivated, and as we'll talk about, motivated in a particular kind of way for their jobs. And engagement is really that sense of they're leaning forward, they're committed, they're going to go above and beyond, they have high ownership. This is what every C-suite, every leader wants for everyone in their organization. And the challenge is that engagement, although we can recognize it when we see it, is kind of, we need to get upstream of that and say, well, okay, but how do I bring that about, right? And I think that's what we're here to talk about today. And one of the things that's going to lead to that high form of engagement is having the right kind of motivation, and ultimately, where does that motivation come from? How do we put together the experiences that bring that engagement forward and allow it to emerge?
Yeah, another phrase we're going to hear a lot about today is self-determination theory. Summarize that just in a basic starting point way so we can then start talking about this.
Sure. Well, self-determination theory is really the most widely used model right now in the world based on how often it's referenced. Self-determination theory is really, over the last 40 years, very empirically trying to look at what we call the basic psychological needs in the individual, identifying what they are. So what are the things that people need, and being able to define those very specifically. And then also looking at the environment around the individual. That could be the circumstances they're in, the way they're interacting with managers or leaders, the way they're interacting with their families. We look at it in all kinds of contexts to kind of see what are the environmental factors that are going to either support the fulfillment of those needs, or conversely are going to thwart those needs, because that's where we see the positive outcomes that we're looking for, or conversely we see more negative outcomes.
At the Returns On Wellbeing Institute, we're our work with employers, we tend to separate engagement into two areas. The first of which is employees' participation in well-being programs. Do they participate, and is that participation enthusiastic? The second level is employees' levels of motivation, involvement, and emotional commitment to their jobs. What Gallup calls employee engagement. Is this a good way to look at it? And what should we think about when we look at these two levels of engagement?
One of the things I find with this word engagement is that we're often naturally wanting to add kind of superlatives, adjectives, things to it to describe a certain quality of that engagement. A quality, when we talk about enthusiasm or ownership, if we really think about those words, we're specifically pointing at something going on intrinsically in the individual. Like there's something that's coming from them when you talk about the distinction between the engagement in wellness or engagement in work, what's great about self-determination theory is it's essentially moving to the most fundamental level of experience that employees need to have in order to have that enthusiastic engagement either in wellness or in their jobs. In other words, it's a tide that raises all boats. And what we see in our data is that when you satisfy basic psychological needs, you're going to see deeper engagement in wellness programs as well as deeper engagement in the job. And it becomes kind of this virtuous cycle.
Scott, employers invest billions of dollars in wellness programs to help employees to become more engaged. With employee engagement so low, Gallup tells us maybe 34%. Where's the disconnect? What's going on?
It's very understandable that leadership is focused on the wellness of their organization and the business. And of course, that involves looking at a lot of outcome metrics. We're looking at performance. We're looking at profitability. We're looking at retention. There's all kinds of things that come into that mix. And engagement very naturally becomes this kind of tool to get to these other outcomes. And so the mentality is engagement becomes instrumental to something else, right? There's an instrumentality to engagement and the way people talk about it when they're sitting around the leadership table, even when they're making decisions about how to institute programs. Most employee engagement programs, the person that is least involved in that process is the employee. Surveys go out to employees, they fill things out. A lot of times there's interventions with managers, but the employee, reports will go out to leadership, reports will go out to division heads, reports will go out to managers about, how your team is doing. How many systems have reports that go to the employee? Imagine for yourself, if you were able to get a report that said, hey, here's your experiences at work. Here are some things that you could be doing to have a better experience, to love your job more, to be more successful. The fact that we're not including employees as the center point in our employee engagement programs doesn't make a lot of sense.
If I have a 5,000 employee firm, how do I reach out to everyone and deal with them as individuals? That's a pretty challenging communication job.
We started out by talking about self-determination theory's focus on basic psychological needs. The beauty of that is that these are basic human needs. The basic needs in our model, autonomy, competence, or a lot of times we call it mastery, and relatedness, and I'm hoping we can maybe drill down into those at some point. These are universal. And so right out of the gate, you know what you need to focus on for every employee, whether you have 50, 500, 5,000, 50,000 employees, you know where you have to focus. The second thing around self-determination theory is that this is an empirical science that's been well validated over 40 years. So not only have we been identifying these constructs, but we've also been validating we can measure them. So we can measure how well they're being fulfilled, how well they're being supported. And if you can measure something quantitatively, you can scale that measurement.
Something that really, I think, goes to the heart of what you're talking about here, and that is when employers offer or rely on incentives to get people to take part in programs. Given what you're talking about here, do incentives have any role to play? When
you use incentives, you've got to understand what are those incentives signaling to the employee. And that's the part that doesn't really get a lot of focus. So I want to come back to how this connects into self-determination theory and a couple concepts I've touched on, but I'll go a little deeper in order to answer your question, Steve. Mm-hmm. One of the basic psychological needs we all have is our need for autonomy. Now, a lot of people, when they hear autonomy, they think, oh, I know what that means. People want to have freedom. They want to have independence. That's not actually what autonomy means in terms of our basic need. Autonomy means that we want to act volitionally. We want to endorse the things that we're doing. We want to feel that we are the authors of what we're doing. And the nuance there is, sure, a lot of times when we have freedom or independence, that gives us a space to operate autonomously. But we can also operate autonomously, even in circumstances where there's a lot of structure, where there's a lot of things that need to get done. In other words, in businesses. The way we act autonomously in those circumstances is that we believe in the thing we're supposed to be doing. We see the rationale for it. We have that sense of endorsement for what we're doing, even when we don't have choice, even when we don't enjoy it. We want to feel like it's been explained to us. We have a rationale. Again, we're acting from that sense of endorsement or purpose. Now, what happens when you enter into that with a reward or an incentive? When an incentive comes in, when we say to an employee, I want you to do this wellness program, and if you do it for 12 weeks, I'm going to give you $150. What have we communicated to the employee? Well, one of the things that incentives communicates, and we've seen this time and again in the research, is it's a mechanism of control, not supporting autonomy. And whenever you dangle an incentive in front of anyone, they see that messaging. They understand that messaging is I'm being told to do this for the money. And that money then, because it's controlling, it actually undermines their motivation. You've communicated the point of this is to get the money. So what do we see time and again? Is that as soon as the incentive is over, as soon as, like, if you do this for 12 weeks, we'll give you $150 off of your insurance premium, or whatever the incentive might be, we see participation drop off. Now, the reason people do it is because it works. So you can see your numbers go up if you offer incentives. But the problem is that they go up in the short term, and the behavior does not sustain unless you somehow keep the incentive going. And this is particularly troublesome or problematic, I'll say, when we're dealing with wellness, something that it really is intrinsic and important for people to internalize and have a sense of purpose around.
You said incentives can have a positive role, but I'm getting it's not the way they typically are being used. There needs to be a rethink on this at a fundamental level. How do you begin that? And then maybe we can start unpacking that in a minute.
We need to shift our thinking to, we want to create experiences that are rewarding, not just a reward, but what's rewarding to the individual. And what feels most rewarding, and we've seen this time again in our research, is people will never ever say, Steve, that they love their job based on incentives. That is not why anyone's going to say they love their job. So think about that disconnect. We want people to be engaged and love their jobs and really be all in, giving people a sense of growth in the organization. Not just I'm getting promoted, I'm getting raises, but my skills are developing. I feel myself getting better. As I get better, I'm seeing new opportunities. I see lanes and pathways for actual growth of meaningful skills and experiences to me. When we stop to take the time to develop pathways where we're making sure our employees are endorsing what they're doing, where they understand the rationales, where we give them meaningful choices, where it's possible to give them choice. When we invest in those kind of programs, we're satisfying needs for autonomy. When we're ensuring that people feel a sense of connection and belonging, we're going to satisfy needs for relatedness. And so really focusing on those basic needs will create a more rewarding environment.
You mentioned environment, and I know I'm very fond of saying that even the very best of well-being programs will not work in a toxic culture. Culture, environment, similar terms. How does culture or environment fit into this?
I keep coming back to the same theme of you need to create an overall culture. I've been saying environment, but an overall culture where what we do here is we support the needs of our people. There isn't some version of people first in the mission statement or in the vision. And I love that that's the aspiration. Like, we all kind of know that's the right thing to do. We know that is where good engagement and well-being and even the business outcomes of productivity and profitability and creativity and innovation, they all come from that. The challenge is, how do we do that? What does that really mean? How do we do that as leadership? How do we put it in place for the organization? How do we put the right cultural norms in place? How do we develop a language across our culture that is going to, help people to kind of get to the level of support and putting people first that we need? That is why we are excited about self-determination theory, because it gives you those things.
Assume for the moment, I've done an assessment of my employees, and I understand that they need to have more physical activity, and they need to have healthier diets. So I bring in a program to do both. Mm-hmm. How can I maximize the likelihood using SDT theory that employees will not only participate, but participate enthusiastically so that their health and well-being improves?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a couple of things. First, to your point, let's assume culturally that the employees trust you as the leader and that you have their interests in mind. And we haven't talked a lot about trust, but
Right.
Believe me, in cultures where there isn't trust, you've already dug a hole for yourself on any program you're trying to implement. So when we think about, well, why do employees trust? Why do they, believe that leadership has their best interests in mind? So I think SDT, first of all, is like, if I'm an employee and you're coming to me with a wellness program, if I feel like, wow, I'm going to have an open mind, I'm going to listen to what's happening, because this leadership has really gone out of their way to prove to me that they're putting me first and my well-being first. And so that immediately gets you a long way down the road, that cultural point. The second point, though, is we now have a specific thing we're trying to get done. We're trying to get people involved with physical activity and nutrition and the elements of the program that you mentioned. So we've got the traditional way of doing it, which is saying, hey, Jim, we have a new program, and if you participate in this program for 12 weeks, you're going to get this discount on your insurance. And that runs into all the problems that we've talked about. Instead, imagine that the program is, hey, we want to tell you about a new program, and you then spend time to talk about and to essentially elicit endorsement of engagement with the program by doing what? Talking about the benefits to the individual, not the incentive to try to get them to take the program. So engage in a conversation with the employees, have team managers talk to them about the program, communicate, here's the purpose of it, have the managers themselves, be sure the managers themselves actually endorse it. So you want to make sure you have that sense of buy-in, you're almost modeling that purpose. And then you want to have a conversation with those employees where you want to hear from them. What do they think about that program? Why might they do it, or why might they not do it? And now you want to listen. And here's the key is you want to listen and accept everything that comes at you. I don't like these physical programs. I've done 12 of these before. I remember this crap from the last company I was at. And that doesn't go anywhere. All right? Don't try to explain that away.
Chronic illness, right? Chronic illness is very costly for companies. The more of it there is, and of course it's horrible for the people that experience it. But how do you potentially walk the line between, of course this is all about you, but the company's success is also about you. Let's not kid ourselves. The healthier you are, it's better for everything, including profits and our ability to pay good benefits and all that. Is there any way to walk that line where it doesn't feel disingenuous but the other direction?
There's absolutely a place to talk about the fact that by us all doing this, it's going to put us in a better position. If we talk about our sense of community, our sense of connection, we're weaving messages of the personal benefits, and we're building purpose in that way. We're engaging in listening exercises, and part of that conversation is, and the great news is that if we all do this together, we'll be able to have more resources to invest back in the company, back in you, back in your training, whatever it might be.
I mean, this ultimately is part of where this engagement comes from, right? I feel like I want this company to succeed, not just because for my own, but I'm part of something bigger. I believe in what it's doing. I have job security, all these things.
We talked a little bit about this idea of supporting people's needs. I don't think you can do that outside the context of talking about the business needs and the business's purpose and, how we're going to, take up a position in the marketplace. How else am I
Right.
going to communicate and build that excitement, build that rationale, build that scaffolding? And so, one of the points I made is you can't take care of your people until you've taken care of your business and you've thought through all those things, because that's a lot of the currency that you're going to take in and build with your people. Now, you want to be thinking about your people as you're thinking about your business, right? That's what I think what good leadership is.
Mental health. Now more than ever, right? There's, and there are degrees of mental health challenges. There are, high stress levels all the way up to, things that require clinical interventions. But one of the hardest things, and we've interviewed numerous people, is assuming a workplace makes resources available so that people can get the help they need, getting people to step up and get the help they need.
One of the things we find is that that if you have a culture, and even more locally, if you feel like your manager is directly focused on the fulfillment of your needs, and the needs that we've talked about are kind of these fundamental psychological needs for health and well-being, then like autonomy support itself is going to create greater trust, create more open communication, relatedness, this sense of I matter to others. We haven't really talked about definitions of these needs. I've mentioned autonomy a lot, a little bit about mastery. Relatedness is that sense of I matter. I matter to you. You matter to me. I feel respected. I feel supported. That's that basic need for relatedness. So that's that third need we haven't gone into in detail. But I think particularly around this, that if there's a focus on those needs, that when it comes time to having a conversation about stress, about that might be kind of global pressures, or in the more specific situation, if I'm an individual and I've tipped over into real kind of pathology, right? Something I really need to engage in EAP or something like that the company's offering, an employee assistance program, then that sense of I matter, I belong, I'm connected is going to be critically important for somebody being willing to have that conversation.
Assume I'm the CEO of an organization, and I've listened to this interview up to now, and I said, okay, Scott, you've got me. I think it's the right thing to do. It does make sense. Tell me, if I do this, it looks like there's going to be some hard work, and it does look like maybe I can repurpose some incentive money that I've been paying over time, because you can't just close it off. What returns, Scott, will I get if I do all this hard work and do all these things, other than the fact that I've done the right thing?
First of all, you'll see direct returns to your bottom line into productivity. There was a meta-analysis done a couple of years ago that one of the great things about self-determination theory is that because it's being tested so broadly, I think there's over 100 citations in various journals and literature to the theory every day. There's over 40,000 citations to the theory last year. So people are out there applying it and extending it and looking at it in different contexts. And a recent meta-analysis looked at 72 workplace studies looking at what are the factors that are most important for both financial outcomes as well as retention in the organization and other things that are directly bearing on ROI across 7 countries, and found that when they looked at what are the global factors that emerge, that the things that I'm talking about from the theory, right, the autonomy support, et cetera, that right, these are the things that drove those outcomes.
You talked about something else too, and assume I'm still that CEO, and I say you're talking about environment and culture. That's squishy stuff. I like looking at balance sheets and cash flow and things I can get my hands around. Your website says that you have a scalable model to measure culture building and the employee experience. Talk about that and how I might use it for my business.
I'm a scientist, but my science is often called a soft science. And I got to tell you guys, I bristle a little bit at that, right? Because when we do things, there's nothing soft about how we do it, right? We're trying to zero in on specific constructs. We're constantly iterating. How can we measure these things precisely, clearly, so that we've got things that are both clear and quantifiable with respect to the experiences, but also to be very buttoned up about then showing how those experiences actually drive, not just correlate, right, but drive outcomes. So many systems out there, they're like, oh, we'll do a driver analysis. They're not looking at a driver analysis. They're looking at a network of they're looking at correlations. And one of the things that can be frustrating for CEOs and for the C-suite is it's really easy to correlate an engagement metric with some kind of an outcome, right? Just take the item, just make one up. I love my job. If you measure I love my job and you measure how high your organization scores, then that, guess what? It's going to be correlated with everything. It's going to be correlated with profitability, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the easy part. Measuring engagement is easy. You have to look at, that doesn't mean you know how engagement happens. You have to know what is the upstream model. What is the A that leads to the B that leads to the C that leads to engagement, that leads to commitment, that leads to the outcomes. That's what we're talking about here in self-determination theory, because we've looked at that and built that model over time. So we're going to be measuring these constructs, and because they're quantifiable, we can measure them at scale. Our system measures all the things we're talking about: basic need support, fulfillment, management. We measure people's sense of vitality, energy, some things we haven't had time to talk about on this call that come out of self-determination theory as well. We can measure all of it in about 6 minutes. The other thing we can do is you finish that, you can fill it out on your phone, and then the employee can, right at the bottom it says, get a report with personalized insights right now. You can click a button and they will get, the employee in real time will get their score profiles, will get insights, and will actually get concrete action items that are customized to their scores to help them start to be like, oh, this is how I can have a more fulfilling work experience.
What are the the three things that you really got to measure in order to measure your culture?
Well, I think you've got to measure the need, fulfillments, and supports in your culture. This is the most fundamental thing you've got to do, right? If your people do not feel that you are supporting their basic psychological needs, the foundation of your culture is never really going to succeed. We've just seen it time and again. So what's nice about self-determination theory is we're not talking about 27 things. Measure the support for 3 basic needs, and you're going to have a great foundation for culture. On top of that,
those are the 3 basic needs that you talked about before: the relatedness, competency, and right.
Autonomy.
Got it. Autonomy. Yes.
Yeah, right. Now, the next thing is you want to measure other supporting factors, in the organization. This is going to be one of the things we call personal resources, which is, people have other things going on in their lives other than work. COVID's a great example. Things happen. They have kids. They can't sleep. So another thing coming out of self-determination theory are measures for mindfulness and vitality. These are what we call personal resources. We also have to measure the sense of how much the company is, beyond supporting my needs, is communicating a sense of purpose and vision for what we're trying to do in the world. That's going to be related to needs, but we kind of call that company pride, and that's an additional kind of supplemental factor. So company pride is important because you need to have a sense of purpose to really optimize people's engagement and motivation. And I can have that sense of purpose locally in my job. In other words, I can see how what I'm doing is contributing to the outcome, right? That's a kind of a localized sense of purpose. I see the rationale, but then you also have to look at the outcome of that work and feel like that has a certain purpose or meaning out in the world that you really believe in. So that's that sense of company pride or purpose. So those are what we call kind of supporting factors. And then The one other thing I would say is all this kind of accrues up to what we call motivational quality, which is this is really this is the metric that we have in our model of how much are people engaged, how much do they love their jobs, and it really what it does is it looks at, do they feel, it combines a bunch of factors. It combines need fulfillment, but it also combines whether I feel like I'm being pressured or controlled. I'm motivated out of pressure or control through obligation or shoulds or other things, versus feeling motivated out of a sense of purpose, enjoyment, etc. And so we kind of put that at the top of our pyramid as a key tracking metric, but it really is something that largely is built from the things that I had already mentioned.
What's realistic if a company designs its well-being program to use this approach? How long might it take for a company to reap returns? And also talk a little bit about one of the upsides about repurposing incentive money.
We do a manager training on this model where we will essentially come in, get an assessment of the organization, the teams, give the manager some feedback on that, let them know kind of here are the team experiences, here's how they're feeling fulfilled or not fulfilled, supported, thwarted, all the things that we've talked about today. And by the way, when we do that, we're not doing it as a performance evaluation. We're doing it as a support always, both to the individuals and to the managers. It's very important because what we don't want to do is we do not want to have anyone feel controlled by this process, right? We want this to feel that this is a support for them. So with that in hand, we then will do a training with them. We've done this training in as little as 3 hours. Usually we like to do sort of a 2 half days or a full day workshop on here are what the basic needs are. Here are best practices. And here are some specific takeaways for how you could put this into action. They have their reports. I don't even need to see their scores. They can see where their areas of need are. And having those reports beforehand helps them to kind of really engage that content more fully. Just based on that, if we then come back and do a 30-day follow-up with them on how things are going, we see changes even over just a 30-day period in terms of how their team feels like their needs are being supported. We then see that then sustain out 90 days, 180 days. And then the program we have, because it's a platform that they can be constantly using for action planning, for ongoing training, that's where we see the long-term effects because the language begins to seep in. I begin to sit in meetings and I hear people talking about mastery, talking about autonomy, talking about relating to spontaneously.
Incentive money. Say I'm paying $700 a year for incentives per employee. If I just cut that off, I'm going to have some really ticked off employees. How do you deal with that?
I don't know that you can cut that off. I think if you've put those incentives in place, it's going to be very difficult to do. And so I think though what you can do is think about how you deploy that money, how you can, and again, it's going to be different for every organization. You need to go into kind of an incentive planning process, but you now have a North Star to point it towards. How are you going to craft that incentive so that it's mainly supportive of needs rather than seen as just kind of a controlling element?
Our audience is going to have a lot of HR executives in it. What advice would you give CHROs on how to convince their CEO that this is the way to go?
The best way to convince them is there is a lot of evidence behind this approach showing its beneficial effect, this kind of tide that raises all boats. So there's a multiple on the ROI
True.
on this. There's financial benefit from this on virtually every metric, and there's a lot of evidence behind that. And what I find helps to keep the door open to the C-suite and move it down the road is to be sure that that piece of evidence is part of that pitch, right? Aspirationally, I as I'm sure we all do, I think there's another pitch to be made, which is there's also a lot of evidence behind this is what does impact the well-being of your people and the well-being of your people is the thing that's going to lead ultimately to the success of the organization, right? And so if you have a C-suite that really believes that, and happily, I think more and more C-suites are getting to that place, that is kind of my lead. That is kind of my lead argument going into those meetings. And the two things aren't unrelated, but I always like to have the second thing as my lead argument because it's more spiritually aligned with what the model is. If you lead with the financial benefits, which are there, then you're just setting this up to be seen as instrumental, and that feels misaligned with its power.
Tell viewers where to go visit to learn more about you and to engage with you.
You can check us out at motivationworks.com. People can always email me directly if they have questions, scott@motivationworks.com. And those are probably the two best places. You could also go to SelfDeterminationTheory.com if you want to go to our not-for-profit. We've set up a not-for-profit called Center for Self-Determination Theory, where we put all the academic literature and research. So if you really want to nerd out and dive in on that, that's available. And yeah, I mean, we're a commercial company, but it's our mission in life to advance the science and to help. I mean, our mission statement is that we work to benefit human well-being and happiness, and we believe that we have a commitment to do that through multiple channels. And so that's why we make sure that we're supporting all the basic science and not-for-profit work alongside, the stuff that keeps the lights on.